Victoria Lang had invited her black housekeeper to the most exclusive gala in Manhattan as a joke, and the moment those ballroom doors opened, the joke turned on her. She was already positioned 6 feet from the entrance when it happened. Jade Holloway on her left, Lila Marsh just behind. Phone open, group chat live, 60-something messages deep since noon. Logistics, laugh emojis. A brief debate about which photographer had the best angle on the entrance. Victoria held her champagne flute with the light grip of someone who already knew how the evening would go. The doors opened. The woman who walked through wore an emerald gown that caught every chandelier in the room at once and threw the light back across the marble floor in fractured arcs. The crowd near the entrance went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience, the involuntary kind. The kind a room produces before it knows why. Victoria moved before the silence could become something she couldn't control. 4 steps, smile arranged, voice pitched to carry just far enough. Perfect timing, Imani. 8 words, delivered at the precise social register that turned them into a public verdict. The champagne tray is short a server. The sentence hit the room flat. A few people laughed, short, reflexive, the laughter of those who follow a room's lead without asking why. A few others went still. Someone's hand stopped mid-reach for a glass. A staff member appeared at Imani's right side, young, visibly uncomfortable, silver tray in one hand and a gold wristband in the other. Standard event issue. The kind worn by catering and serving personnel. A small piece of laminated plastic that said, without words, "You are not a guest here." He extended it toward Imani's wrist, with the apologetic expression of someone executing an order they already knew was wrong. Near the main entrance, a security guard turned from the door and ran her invitation code a 3rd time. There was no procedural reason for it. He ran it anyway, his eyes moving from the scanner to her face with the slow appraisal of a man whose assumptions were running ahead of his evidence. Victoria turned to Jade with a small, satisfied tilt of the chin. Let's see how she plays this. Imani stood at the center of the entrance, in a gown that cost more than the catering contract for the entire evening, with a serving tray 12 inches from her left hand and a staff wristband being offered to her right wrist, while the room waited to see what she would do. She did not take the tray. She did not take the wristband. She stood exactly where she was and did not move, and the staff member lowered the tray 2 inches without being told to. 6 feet away, a woman in a sharp gray dress had stopped entirely, not watching the confrontation, watching the dress. Her eyebrows drew together slowly. "Wait," she said, barely audible. "That gown." She didn't finish. Nobody heard it. A woman in a $5 million dress had just been handed a serving tray in front of all of Manhattan's elite. And the most dangerous thing in the room was not Victoria Lang's smile. It was the fact that Imani Caldwell had not yet decided what to do with hers. Imani did not take the tray. She let her hands stay where they were, loose at her sides, and looked at Victoria with the calm of someone measuring a distance larger than the physical one between them. The staff member stood with the wristband still in his fingers. 3 seconds. 4. Then, without instruction, he lowered his arm and stepped back. The crowd had not moved on. Conversations had resumed in the mechanical way of people performing disinterest in the exact thing they were most interested in. A group of 3 men near the first table had turned back to each other, but their eyes kept traveling over each other's shoulders. And then, from somewhere to Imani's left, a man asked without lowering his voice whether the woman in the green dress was part of the evening's entertainment, some kind of staff performance, he said, using the phrase with the easy authority of someone who had never once considered how it landed on the person it described. Imani heard every word. It pulled something loose, a flash, The kind that surfaces when the present resembles the past closely enough to overlap. Victoria on the main staircase of the townhouse 3 days ago, standing in the upper hallway in her robe, talking down to Jade in the entrance hall below, her voice carrying the way voices carry in marble-floored spaces designed without concern for the people who worked in them. "Inviting that girl to the gala would be so entertaining," she'd said. "Can you imagine?" Laughter, unhurried and light. And below, on the floor, on her knees with a cloth, Imani scrubbing grout between imported tiles and saying nothing. The room came back. Her phone vibrated twice against the pocket sewn into the gown's left hip. 2 short buzzes. Ava's pattern for a voice note she needed her mother to hear. She didn't reach for it. She already knew. Ava had sent the same thing before every hard day for the past year, borrowed from her grandmother, and repeated with the solemn conviction of a child who understood more than any adult had consciously taught her. "Shoulders back, Mommy. Remember." That voice, small and certain, reset something in Imani's spine. She straightened, barely perceptibly, just enough. The crowd was still watching, some openly, most pretending not to. A woman in ivory taffeta was technically speaking to Jade, but her attention hadn't left the green dress since Imani walked through the door. Someone at the nearest table had turned his chair by a few degrees, the kind of adjustment that looks accidental and isn't. This was the world Imani had been living in for 10 months. Not this room specifically, but this exact dynamic. The appraisal, the assumption. The way a space contracts around a person it has already decided doesn't belong. She had chosen that life deliberately, walked away from the only name that had ever preceded her into a room, moved herself and her daughter into a 3-room apartment in the Bronx, and taken a job through a placement agency that asked no unnecessary questions. She had wanted to know what she was when the name wasn't attached. She had wanted her daughter to grow up understanding what it cost to keep the lights on. 8 months with Victoria Lang had been an education in how certain kinds of power sustained themselves, not through force, but through the accumulated weight of small, deniable gestures. The glance that traveled past you, the sentence that placed you without naming you, the invitation that was really a trap. She understood why she was here tonight. She had understood it since the cream envelope arrived. What she hadn't decided yet was what she was going to do about it. Near her right shoulder, a server who had been passing with a tray slowed and leaned in slightly, voice kept low enough for only her. "You don't have to take that." He meant the wristband. He meant the tray. He meant the whole architecture of what was being constructed around her in this room. Imani turned just enough to look at him. She gave him a real smile, not the polished one she kept ready for rooms like this, but the kind that cost something. Then she turned back toward the ballroom without answering. But the question had already formed in the crowd's collective awareness, moving beneath the resumed conversations like a current beneath still water. Why wasn't she reacting? Why was she standing in a gown she could not possibly own, while someone tried to mark her as serving staff, and saying nothing at all? What did she know that the room didn't? Victoria read the crowd and recalibrated. The entrance moment hadn't landed right. The laughter had been too sparse, too short, too uncertain. And now Imani was standing in the room with a stillness that was drawing the wrong kind of attention. Not the ridicule Victoria had engineered, but something quieter and more persistent. People were looking at the dress. People were looking at Imani, looking in a way that had passed beyond the social reflex of following the room's lead and into something more individual, more considered. Victoria set her champagne flute on a passing tray and moved to intercept. She found Imani near the east side of the room and steered her toward a larger cluster of guests, with a hand placed barely at the small of her back. The gesture that, from a distance, reads as guidance, but means ownership. The group was right. Real estate money, investment money, foundation money. The kind of people whose opinions traveled through this city and shaped it. The right witnesses. Everyone. Victoria's voice gathered the group the way it always did, not by volume, by gravity. I want to introduce someone. This is Imani. She works for me. The pause after that was brief and deliberate. I've always believed in giving people the opportunity to experience a better life. Two people nodded. Someone made a small sound of approval. A woman nearby smiled with the gracious warmth of someone who found the sentiment admirable without examining what it was doing. Imani stood exactly still. She held her posture and said nothing. She was keeping a record. Victoria continued. She spoke about opportunity, about how exposure to environments like this could change a person's trajectory if the right doors were opened. And then she said that she had done everything she could to help Imani get out of where she came from. Not one word was technically offensive, not one phrase was actionable, but the sentence did exactly what it was designed to do. It nailed Imani to a position, sealed the room's understanding of who she was and where she belonged, and did it so smoothly that no one present had to acknowledge they were watching it happen. A man in the group glanced at Imani once and looked away. A woman nearby touched her own necklace briefly, then stopped. Imani tracked every micro-movement and noted that not one of them had yet looked directly at her. She was also aware that her seat assignment had been changed. She had memorized the table number from the escort card at the entrance. When she passed the floor layout, she had found it, a table near the catering corridor, adjacent to the kitchen service entrance, appearing on no printed program. Added specifically, recently, for an audience of one. Along the east wall, a photographer moved in slow arcs. He had photographed Victoria twice already, with the patient focus of someone who had been briefed on what the evening's real story was. But something else was moving through the room, not announced, not broadcast, passed device to device in the manner of content too significant to contain. A screenshot. Imani tracked it by watching where eyes went after people glanced at their phones. The small reset of expression. The fractional pause before resuming conversation. It was crossing the east section, moving toward the center tables. Not everyone. Not yet. The woman in gray. She had been at the entrance, had tracked the movement across the room, was now standing 8 feet from Imani. No longer trying to place the dress, something in her expression had resolved from uncertainty into a different kind of attention entirely. She stepped closer, studying the left shoulder seam with the focused stillness of someone whose professional eye had found what it was looking for. She turned to a woman beside her, voice low. That is not a lone piece. You're certain? That gown has never been in public before tonight. A pause. The woman who made it would know the moment she saw it. She reached for her phone and sent a message without explaining to whom. Across the east floor, Victoria was still building momentum, speaking now about a charitable initiative, about her work for underprivileged communities, using Imani's presence as a kind of living exhibit. The phrases arrived with the unhurried largesse of someone who had never once examined how they landed on the people they described. Imani was no longer being spoken to. She was being displayed. She stood in the cluster and said nothing, and her eyes, for the first time since she had walked through those ballroom doors, were no longer carrying patience. She was observing. The moment Victoria chose to formalize it came 40 minutes into the evening. She raised her voice just enough, the calibrated elevation of a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much volume was needed to make a room pause without making it a scene. 50 or 60 people stopped. That was enough. She positioned herself beside Imani at the center of the east floor and addressed the gathered guests with a pleasantly furrowed expression, the look of someone raising a minor procedural concern for everyone's benefit. I just want to make sure there's no misunderstanding. The smile was intact. It was a very good smile. "Imani, would you mind if we confirmed your credentials? I just want to make sure you have everything you need to be here this evening." Every word technically neutral. Every word carrying the weight of publicly questioning whether a woman standing in the center of this room had the right to be there. A security guard was already moving from the side entrance, handheld scanner in hand. 3 phones had risen near the south tables, not selfie angles, but the fixed horizontal position of devices capturing something. Someone was live streaming. A second phone joined within 30 seconds. The guard ran the scan. The device processed. Green indicator. Her code was valid, ironclad, issued directly from Victoria's own household account. The guard looked at the scanner. He looked at Victoria. He said nothing. Victoria did not acknowledge the result. She continued as though it had confirmed her position rather than directly contradicted it. "The thing is," she said, still pleasant, turning back to the crowd that had formed, "Imani is here as my guest. She is my housekeeper." A half-second pause, perfectly placed. "A capable woman, but her salary is perhaps a few $1,000s a month, and I want to make sure she's comfortable. These events can feel very overwhelming for people who aren't accustomed to them." Nobody used a slur. Nobody made a direct reference to race. Nobody had to. The sentence had placed Imani's income in the room, attached it to her body, made the green gown on her back into an incongruity the crowd was now being invited to explain. Out of place. The words moved through the nearest cluster without anyone saying them aloud, and everything else followed. Someone near the back of the east floor exhaled audibly, a short, involuntary sound, the auditory equivalent of deciding not to speak. A man in his 60s, 3 rows back, had turned his attention to the ceiling. A young woman in a staff lanyard near the catering corridor had pressed herself against the wall. She was gripping her own wrist. The photographer was still shooting. Imani's phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out. A text message. Ava. Not a voice note this time. Her daughter had typed it in the thumb-careful way of a child who had recently learned to text, but still spelled phonetically when she was anxious. "Mommy, are they laughing because of your job again?" 7 words from a 7-year-old in a Bronx apartment who was supposed to be asleep, who had been told only that her mother was at a fancy work event. Nothing to worry about. 7 words that took everything abstract about this evening and made it entirely, irreversibly real. Her daughter had noticed. Her daughter had named it. Across the city, past her bedtime, holding a phone she wasn't supposed to still be awake with, asking whether the world was laughing at her mother's job again. Imani read it a second time. She thought about walking out. Not an impulse, a real calculation. If she left now, she preserved everything. The 10 months, the anonymity, the promise she had made to herself to complete this on her own terms. She could take the service corridor, be in a car in 4 minutes, home before Ava fell back to sleep. She could text her daughter that some people were silly and it didn't matter. She could keep the promise. She could protect all of it. But her daughter was awake, asking if people were laughing because of her job. And the young woman near the corridor wall was still gripping her wrist, and the man who had refilled Imani's water glass 3 times that evening, she had thanked him by name, she had been the only one who thanked him, was standing near the kitchen door with the fixed expression of someone who had been on this side of every room, many times, for many years. If she left, she protected herself. Everything stayed exactly as it was. She read Ava's message one more time. Then she put the phone in her pocket. She did not walk out. The program shifted at 8:45. The fashion tribute had been scheduled as the gala's midpoint anchor, the portion of the evening where 400 guests directed their collective attention toward a screen and the conversations quieted into the practiced semi-attention of people who knew when the program required an appearance of engagement. Most would remember it pleasantly and vaguely by morning. Tonight was different. The honoree was Adelaide Caldwell. The artistic director's introduction covered the established biography with the measured cadence of a man addressing a room that already knew everything he was saying and needed only the ceremony of being told again. 50 years in haute couture. The Palme de la Création, awarded by 3 separate European fashion councils, the only designer of the 20th century to receive it more than once. The Caldwell Luxe Empire. The jewelry house, the couture division, the archive, the foundation. Its valuation mentioned only in passing, in the manner that serious money is always mentioned in rooms where everyone already knows the number. On the projection screen, Adelaide Caldwell appeared in real time. She was 71 years old and carried herself with the posture of a woman who had long stopped concerning herself with what 71 was supposed to look like. She sat in what was clearly a working studio. Drafting table at the edge of frame, a dress form behind her bearing something unfinished. Not a formal setting, a working one, which was the only kind she used. She spoke about craft, about duration, about the responsibility of beauty. Her exact phrase, said with the precision of someone who had turned it over for decades and found it still accurate. The room listened in the way rooms listen to authority that has not been manufactured. The speech had been scheduled for 7 minutes. At the 4-minute mark, the broadcast director made the standard cutaway, a wide pan of the live room to establish the event context for the feed. The camera swept the crowd in a slow arc. It found Imani. Not by design, by geography. She was standing near the center of the floor, and the camera's arc carried through it, settling on a woman in an emerald gown for approximately 2 seconds. In the camera's rendering, the green was even more saturated than it appeared to the human eye. The stones on the shoulders sent a ripple of refracted light across the frame. On the screen at the front of the ballroom, Adelaide Caldwell stopped speaking. Not a breath pause. Not an effect pause. A stop. The kind an audience registers as interruption before it can identify what was interrupted. On the feed, Adelaide was looking at something left of her own camera, presumably a monitor showing the live room. Her face did not change dramatically. It went still. The stillness of recognition, catching a person before they've decided what to do with it. When she spoke again, she spoke more slowly. That gown. 2 words. An identification, not a statement. The room, which had been in comfortable semi-attention, sharpened. Not all of it, not all at once, but enough people caught the shift in Adelaide's register to send a ripple of refocus through the crowd. Adelaide waited 2 beats. That gown was never sold. It was made for one woman. The woman in gray, standing near the center aisle, inhaled audibly. The murmur that moved through the east section had a different texture from the earlier ones. This one was revision, the audible sound of a room updating an assumption it had already made. Victoria felt the shift before she parsed it. She looked at the screen, then at Imani, then back at the screen. Adelaide was still on the feed, still looking at her room monitor, and her expression had moved past recognition into something more deliberate. Victoria crossed to the program director's technical station in 6 fast steps and spoke in a low voice with the urgency of someone accustomed to having urgencies addressed. The coordinator looked uncertain. Victoria pressed, harder this time. The coordinator reached for the board. The feed went dark. The room that followed was not the comfortable silence of an audience waiting for the program to resume. It was 400 people holding a fragment of incomplete information and working with what they'd been given. If that gown had never been sold, if it was made for one specific woman, if the woman on that floor was wearing it right now, then who exactly was she? The woman in gray walked directly to Imani without asking permission. She leaned in at a professional angle and examined the left shoulder seam without touching it. 10 seconds. then 15. Then she straightened. "May I?" she said, low, gesturing at the interior neckline with 2 fingers. Imani turned slightly, allowing the access. 3 seconds. The woman found what she was looking for and straightened. She turned to a colleague standing close behind her and said quietly, "Caldwell archive mark." The colleague's eyes widened by a precise fraction. The information began moving through the crowd, not announced, not broadcast, passed in the manner of things that spread when someone with authority says something quietly to someone else. Not everyone heard it. Enough did. Victoria was watching from across the room. On the surface, her expression had not changed, but her hand had tightened around her champagne flute until the stem was pale between her fingers. Because the room was no longer looking at Imani Caldwell the way it had been looking at her 90 minutes ago, and Victoria could not identify the exact moment the shift had happened, which was the most alarming thing she had faced in 30 years of managing rooms. Victoria made her decision in the time it took to set down her champagne flute. She crossed the room with the purposeful movement of a woman who had decided that momentum was the solution, that if she moved quickly enough, with enough authority, the situation would reorganize itself around her the way it always had. She had managed this industry for 3 decades. She had survived things that ended lesser careers. The first person to control a narrative controlled the outcome, and she was not going to let a woman in a green dress narrate the story of her own gala. She positioned herself between Imani and the gathering crowd and raised her voice to the register that was not quite a scene, but was clearly a declaration. "What we're seeing here is a sophisticated forgery." Her tone carried the reluctant gravity of civic duty. "Archive pieces get reproduced. It's a known industry problem." She turned toward the nearest security personnel. "I want someone to escort this woman to a holding area while we verify the item's provenance. This is a private event, and it is my responsibility to ensure the integrity of everything in this room." The security team exchanged a glance. Victoria pressed, "If the piece is legitimate, there is nothing to worry about. If it has been borrowed without authorization, or taken, that is a very different matter." The implication was clean and complete. The room had gone still again, but not in the way of a room following Victoria's lead. This was the stillness of a room that had begun keeping its own record. 3 people near the south tables had their phones raised, not pointed at Imani, pointed at Victoria. A man in his 60s with a silver tie, his name was on the building, stepped forward from the nearest cluster. He spoke without raising his voice. "That's not how this works, Victoria." He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Victoria did not look at him. She kept her focus on the security team. One guard took a single step toward Imani and stopped. He had noticed what several people around him were noticing simultaneously. The space around Imani was not clearing. It was consolidating. The woman in gray stood directly at her left. The colleague who had examined the dress hadn't moved from her right. The building's owner had taken a second step forward. Nobody was making a speech. Nobody was staging anything. But the floor had reorganized itself, and Victoria was on one side of a line she hadn't chosen to stand on. From somewhere near the east wall, a voice said into the room, "I've seen the screenshot." Not directed at anyone, not needing a recipient. The kind of sentence released into a crowd because everyone present already understood who it concerned. Several phones already held the image. A screenshot of Victoria's private story, her account unmistakable. The font, the aesthetic, the grid that half of Manhattan followed. The words on the screen were 6. "People like her don't belong here." Posted 3 hours before the gala, set to her close friends list, which had apparently included at least one person who no longer considered themselves a close friend. The screenshot had been moving through the room since the escalation, passing device to device through the east section and into the center tables. But now, people were reading it aloud to the person beside them. Now people were reading it alongside Victoria's earlier words, the help her get out of where she came from, the salary named in front of assembled guests, the charitable framing of a woman who was standing 6 feet away and holding all of it together in one hand. The man who had nodded along with Victoria's charity commentary 40 minutes earlier was no longer nodding. He stood with his arms at his sides, processing an expense he had not anticipated. Jade had found a position against the far wall, her body angled away, her attention fixed on her phone with the studied focus of someone who had decided they were not here. Lila had gone to the powder room corridor 16 minutes ago and had not returned. Victoria was standing alone on the east floor. She understood this. She could read a room's geometry as well as anyone alive, and what the geometry told her now was withdrawal. The slow, undeniable physics of support leaving a position. But 30 years of being right and being followed had given her a momentum that carried her 2 steps further than it should have. She turned to Imani directly. For the first time all evening, she dropped the performance entirely and spoke to her as herself. Voice low but not private, stripped of the pleasantness that had insulated every earlier sentence. "You should leave, before this gets worse for everyone." The room heard it. The room heard what it was. Imani reached into the pocket of her gown. She took out a cream-colored card, thick, unadorned, no printed text. Her mother had pressed it into her hand 3 days ago and told her she would know when the moment arrived. She unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting. 1 sentence. Do not shrink. Not an instruction, not a reminder, a permission. Imani folded the card and returned it to her pocket. She looked at Victoria once, the look of someone who has resolved all remaining ambivalence and is no longer in the business of deciding. Then she walked toward the front of the room. The microphone stand was still live. It had been left at the front of the presentation stage after Imani Caldwell's tribute segment ended and the feed was cut. Nobody had struck it. Perhaps nobody had thought to. Perhaps someone had thought to and then watched the room and decided against it. Imani reached it without being stopped. That was the detail people carried home. Not the gown, not the speech, not even the reveal itself, but that specific fact. She crossed the full length of the ballroom and not one person stopped her. No security stepped forward. No coordinator intervened. 400 people made 400 small individual decisions to move aside, and she walked through all of them. She stood at the stand without touching it, without speaking, and waited. The room came to her. 400 voices dropped. On the rear projection screen behind her, something appeared. She had not triggered it. She would learn later that the same person who had leaked the screenshot through the crowd had, at some point in the previous 10 minutes, accessed the presentation system. The image was 20 feet wide and entirely legible from every point in the ballroom. Victoria's private story. Her account unmistakable, the 6 words stark against the clean aesthetic of her carefully maintained social presence. People like her don't belong here. 400 people read it at the same time. The silence that followed was not shock, it was recognition. The quiet that settles over a room when the thing it suspected has been confirmed in writing and put on a wall. Victoria did not move. Her posture held. She would not give the room the satisfaction of watching it break. But her face had the tight, controlled stillness of someone maintaining an expression by force alone. Imani looked at the room. She took one breath. I want to talk about invisible people. Her voice through the PA system was unhurried, and it filled the room completely, not because she was projecting, but because 400 people had chosen to be genuinely quiet for it. Not because they don't exist. Because we choose not to see them. She did not raise her voice. Those who clean your glasses, serve your wine, make your world look effortless. They are the ones you walk past without a second thought. Not because they are forgettable, because you have decided not to remember them. She turned slightly, her gaze moving across the crowd without accusation, without theater. The gaze of someone taking an accounting. The woman who fixed your gown in the restroom an hour ago. You didn't catch her name. You may not have looked up. Near the service entrance, a woman in a staff lanyard had gone very still. Her hands were at her sides. The man refilling your glass. The one who moved your chair when you sat. The one who straightened the centerpiece after a child knocked it. Those 3 things were done by the same person. He has been here since 4 o'clock this afternoon. Near the east entrance, a man holding an empty tray had stopped moving entirely. His eyes were fixed on Imani. I know their names. Raphael, Denise, Joe. A beat. Raphael has a daughter starting college in September. He is working 2 events this weekend to cover her first month's tuition. Denise has been at this venue for 9 years and has been passed over for the senior coordinator position 3 consecutive times. Joe takes the 4 train home after close, and close is usually after midnight. The room was not moving. I know these things because for 10 months, I have been one of them. She let it land. 1 second. 2. 3. 4. My name is Imani Caldwell. There was no eruption, no single dramatic gasp. A wave. The sustained pressure of 400 people receiving the same information at the same speed. The collective intake of breath. The low sound of realization moving through a crowd the way a front moves through weather before anyone can name what's arriving. Then one voice in the middle of the room said her full name. Then another. The wave continued, rolling, uneven, building not to a peak, but to a sustained, altered state. Victoria did not move. I am the heir to Caldwell Lux, Imani continued. I spent 10 months working anonymously as a household manager because I needed to understand something no inheritance teaches. I needed to know what it felt like to stand in a room like this. A pause. And be invisible in it. She did not look at Victoria. She didn't need to. That sentence behind me was written about me tonight. But I want you to hear it the way Raphael and Denise and Joe hear it. Not as something said about the Caldwell heir. As something said about anyone holding a tray or a mop in a building full of people who decided not to see them. She indicated the service corridor, the kitchen door, the staff positioned along the margins. They belong in this room as much as anyone holding a glass. From the south tables, a man in his 50s stood, 2 years into a commercial real estate agreement with Victoria Lang's firm. He looked at his seat for a moment, then at the screen, then at Victoria. He took a business card from his jacket pocket, placed it face down on the tablecloth, walked to the program director's table, spoke a few words, shook the director's hand, and walked toward the exit. He was the first. A second person stood within 30 seconds, then a third. Imani watched the room do what rooms do when the person managing them loses the management. She had not come to the microphone to destroy Victoria Lang. She had come because her daughter was awake in the Bronx asking whether people were laughing at her mother again, and because that question deserved a better answer than silence. She had come because the woman near the catering corridor was still gripping her wrist, and because Raphael was still on shift, and because dignity without witness helps only one person. I am not angry at this room, she said. I am asking it to look at itself. She stepped back from the microphone. The woman in gray began to applaud. The applause that built was uneven and human, not the coordinated response of an audience following a cue, but the real sound of people arriving at the same place at different speeds. Some immediately, some after a pause, some after watching the person beside them and deciding. The late arrivals came in at irregular intervals, the way rain arrives after the storm has already started. Victoria Lang stood on the east floor of the Whitmore Ballroom while 400 people rearranged their understanding of the evening. She was entirely alone. For the first time in 30 years, she was standing in the wrong room. Victoria Lang's public apology arrived 48 hours after the gala. 4 paragraphs. Drafted by her communications team, revised 3 times, parsed for liability before it was parsed for sincerity. It acknowledged the incident. It expressed regret for any offense caused. It referenced her long-standing commitment to equity and inclusion in all professional environments. It did not say, "I treated a woman as a prop in my own entertainment, and I did not care how it hurt her." Imani read it standing at the kitchen counter in the Bronx apartment, her coffee cooling beside her. She read it once, set the phone face down, and went to make Ava's breakfast. 3 days after the apology was released, she agreed to speak publicly. Not to the fashion press. The woman in gray had asked, and Imani had appreciated the ask and declined it. She gave a single interview to a small independent outlet covering labor rights and service industry workers in New York City. The interview ran 40 minutes. The transcript was shared 40,000 times in its first week. It said nothing she hadn't already said at the microphone at the Whitmore, but this time the audience was Raphael and Denise and Joe and the hundreds of thousands of people who rode trains home after midnight from rooms they were never invited into. And they read it the way people read things that name what they have been living. When Imani visited Victoria in person 5 days after the gala, she had requested the meeting, which surprised Victoria enough that she agreed without fully understanding why. She did not sit across a desk from her. She sat in the same chair she had always used in that house, the one near the kitchen door. She said, "The issue isn't that you didn't know who I was." She let that settle. "The issue is that you believed a housekeeper deserved to be treated that way." Victoria said nothing. There was nothing to say to a sentence that accurate. The consequences for Victoria developed as consequences for powerful people tend to develop, not as a single collapse, but as a long withdrawal. One contract, then another, then a third ending quietly 10 days later without public statement. 3 former household employees gave detailed, consistent statements to a labor journalist who had been following the story. The journalist published them without embellishment, and the dates and amounts in the statements spoke for themselves. 6 former employees went on record in total. 2 had stories predating Imani's tenure by years. Victoria kept her firm. She kept her properties. She maintained her position in the industry, in the technical sense of the phrase. But certain rooms that had previously opened easily began to require a longer wait, and some of them did not open again. She understood it the way you understand winter arriving, not by the first cold day, but by the accumulation of them. Adelaide Caldwell arrived at the collection preview 5 weeks after the gala, walking beside her daughter with the expression of someone who had been patient for a very long time and recognized the moment they were waiting for. The collection was called Work. 12 pieces, each created in direct collaboration with a service worker from the hospitality and domestic industry, not as models, not as symbolic figures, but as creative participants. Each piece incorporated a design element proposed by the worker who made it alongside her. The profits were divided between Caldwell Luxe's production costs and an education fund established in Ava's name, supporting post-secondary education for the children of domestic and service industry workers across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The fashion press covered it with the mixed fascination of an industry encountering something that made it uncomfortable about itself. The collection sold out in 11 days. The story continued in smaller spaces after that. A Midtown hotel revised its staff conduct policy after 3 employees brought the labor journalist's article to their HR department and asked by name whether the current guidelines met the standard Imani Caldwell had described. A Brooklyn catering company started quarterly acknowledgement events for senior staff, a paid afternoon, a company newsletter entry, a lunch with management that was not performative. They had been intending to do it for years. They did it now. A woman who managed corporate dining for a financial district firm started a private group chat with 4 colleagues in the same industry. They called it Work 2. They met in person once a month and talked about the parts of the job that no one else talked about. Not headlines, not covered, but real and compounding in the way that things compound when they begin with recognition. Imani went home the night after the collection preview on the subway because she wanted to. She sat in the second car with her block heels in her bag, the Gala stilettos in a box in her closet waiting for the next occasion that required them. She looked at the other people in the car at 11:30 on a Thursday night. The woman with the cleaning supply bag between her feet. The man in a hotel uniform with his eyes closed. The couple sharing food from a takeout container. The teenager with headphones and a backpack full of textbooks. She knew what they were coming from. She knew because she had been coming from the same place for 10 months, and whatever came next, she intended to keep knowing it. Ava was awake when she got home. She was sitting at the kitchen table under the yellow overhead light with a drawing in front of her and the expression of a child who has been caught and pre-decided it doesn't matter. "You should be asleep," Imani said. "I know." Ava pushed the drawing across the table. A woman in a green dress, the proportions entirely a child's. The dress occupied most of the paper, the figure's head too large, the shoes triangles. But the stones along the left shoulder had been colored with care, small and close together in green and gold crayon, each one given its own attention. Around the figure, Ava had drawn other people. Small figures of varying sizes, each identifiable by what they held. A tray, a broom, a stack of books, a sponge, a mop, a glass. They were all facing the same direction. Imani sat across from her daughter. Ava looked up. Her voice was quiet and certain, the way it got when she had been thinking about something for a long time. "I'm proud of you, Mommy." A pause. "Because you didn't bow your head." Imani looked at her daughter's face for a long moment. She got up and went to stand behind Ava's chair. Her daughter understood without being asked. She reached up and found the small zipper at the back of the gown and pulled it down slowly, carefully. The way she always handled things she understood were important. The emerald fabric loosened. Imani stepped out of it, draped it over the back of a kitchen chair, and stood in the small, warm room in bare feet on a linoleum floor. She thought about 10 months of early mornings and late trains, and a paycheck she had actually needed, and a floor she had actually scrubbed on her knees on a Tuesday afternoon. The gown in storage. One sentence in her mother's handwriting. 7 words from a 7-year-old who was supposed to be asleep. She thought about the messages that had arrived over the past week. Not to the heiress, not to the story, but to the 40-second clip someone had recorded of her at the microphone and shared without asking. Voice notes, short texts, from people she would never meet in break rooms and service corridors and Bronx apartments and hotel back offices and commuter train cars at midnight. And then the one that had come through that morning while she stood at the stove. A voice note from a number she didn't recognize, from somewhere far away. A woman's voice, warm and tired. The words were simple and direct. "Thank you for speaking for us." Imani had listened to it twice. Then she had set the phone face up on the counter and left it there. Now she looked at her daughter. "You want something to eat?" "Rice," Ava said, without hesitation. Imani laughed. She went to the stove. Ava pulled herself up onto the counter nearby to watch, sitting with her feet dangling and her hands gripping the edge, entirely at home. The rice from dinner was still in the pot. Imani turned the burner on low. Dignity does not wait to be given. It does not require a gown or a last name or the right room. It requires only the decision to stop allowing anyone else to tell you it doesn't belong to you. The rice began to warm. The kitchen was warm. That was enough.